Jane rather surprised me. I knew she had an interested, if generalized, awareness of the old theory of the ether, or the lumiferious ether, but I hadn't realized she was well enough acquainted with the ideal to be able to verbalize it that sufficiently for Seth. In several texts the authors wrote about the ether, and Jane may have read those passages. I may have discussed the theory with her, but I don't remember doing so. The ideal of the ether, or something like it, had been around since the time of the ancient Greeks. By the last decades of the 19th century, and in line with Newtonian physics, the ether was postulated as an invisible, tasteless, odorless substance that pervaded all unoccupied space and served as a medium for the passage of electromagnetic waves of light and other kinds of radiant energy, like heat, just as the earth itself serves as the medium for the transmission of seismic waves, for instance. Late in the last century, some very ingenious experiments failed to scientifically prove the existence of the ether, however, and the theory was finally dispensed with for good, following Albert Einstein's publication of his special theory of relativity in 1905. I think the ideal of the ether is an excellent example of how man has always attempted to posit or visualize in physical reality his innate knowledge of Framework 2. Note, Unknown Reality contains excerpts from one of the sessions Seth has given on the inner self-conscious self. Now I'm going to go down to where he begins. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. The main myth through which you interpret your experiences, however, is the one that tells you that all perception and knowledge must come to you through the physical senses. This is the myth of the exteriorized consciousness, a consciousness that you are told is open-ended only so far as objective reality is concerned. It seems to be closed at the other end, which in those terms would represent your birth. The consciousness of that myth can indeed have no origin, for the myth precludes anything but a physically oriented and physically mechanized consciousness. Not only could that consciousness have no existence before or after death, but obviously it could have no access to knowledge that was not physically acquired. It is this myth that hampers your understanding most of all, and that closes you off from the greater nature of those events with which you are most intimately concerned. That myth also makes your own involvement with mass events sometimes appear incomprehensible. There seems to be no reason for many of them, simply because the intricate inner communication systems of consciousness go utterly unrecognized, generally speaking. I am speaking largely to a Western audience, and so here I am using terms for a particular reason, to explain concepts in a way that will be understood. The inner ego is perfect as a term to suit my purposes. Let me stress again that the unconscious is indeed conscious, and by conscious I mean that its reasoning is not irrational, its methods are not chaotic, and its characteristics are not only equal to those of the known ego, but indeed are most resilient and knowledgeable. Frameworks 1 and 2 obviously represent not only different kinds of reality in normal terms, but two different kinds of consciousness. To make this discussion as simple as possible for now, at least think of these two frameworks or states of consciousness as being connected by undifferentiated areas in which sleep, dreaming, and certain trance states have their activity. Those undifferentiated areas are involved in the constant translation of one kind of consciousness into the other, and with energy transferences. You constantly process those data that come to you in your private life, and that information includes bulletins from all over the world, through your news broadcast, and so forth. The inner ego has access, again, to a much vaster amount of knowledge. It is aware not only of its own private position, as you are of yours, but it is also familiar with the mass events of its reality. It is intimately involved in the creation of your own private experience. I said that the inner ego reasons, but its reasoning is not restricted to the cause and effect limitations that you apply to the reasoning process. The action of the inner ego within the wider sphere of Framework 2 explains many events and seeming coincidences that otherwise seem to make no sense within your world. Many realities within Framework 2 cannot suitably be explained as facts to you in Framework 1, simply because they involve psychological thicknesses that cannot be translated into facts as you think of them. These often appear in the symbolic language of the arts instead, and many of your dreams are translations in which the events of Framework 2 appear in symbolic form. Give us a moment. On any given day, the events of your private lives fit within the larger pattern of world events in which they have their context. On any given night, the intimate events of your dream lives your dream lives also exist in the greater context of the world's dreams in which they have their reality. Give us a moment. The consciousness that you have, as generally described in psychology, is in a strange fashion like the bright, shiny skin of a fruit, but with no fruit inside. A consciousness with a shiny surface that responds to sun or rain or temperature and to its surroundings, but for all of that, a psychological fruit that has no pulp or pits, but contains at its heart a vacancy. In those terms, you experience only one half of your consciousness, the physically attuned portion. Fruit trees have roots, but you assign no ground of being to this consciousness. Jung's collective unconscious was an attempt to give your world its psychological roots, but Jung could not perceive the clarity, organization, and deeper context in which that collective unconscious has its own existence. Reality as Framework 2 is organized in a different fashion than it is in the Framework 1. And the processes of reasoning are far quicker. In Framework 1, the reasoning processes work largely by deduction, and they must constantly check their own results against the seemingly concrete experience of physical events. The reasoning of the inner ego is involved with the creative invention of those experiences. It is involved with events in a context of a different kind, for it deals intimately with probabilities. Each of you, with your beliefs and intents, tell the inner ego which of an infinite number of probable events you want to encounter. In the dream state, events from both frameworks are processed. The dream state involves not only a state of consciousness that exists between the two frameworks of reality, but also involves, in those terms, a connecting reality of its own. Here I would like to emphasize that to one degree or another, all species of plant and animal life dream. The same applies to the psychological activity of atoms and molecules and any particle, period. There are intensities of behavior, then, in which the inside activity of any being or particle is directed toward the physical force that is involved in the cooperative venture that causes your reality. There are variances, however, when such activity is directed instead into the interior nature of reality. You have an inner system of communication, then, in which the cells of all living things are connected. In those terms, there is a continuum of consciousness. To really understand your own connection with the events you encounter privately and in relationship to others, you must first become acquainted with that medium in which events themselves are formed. What part, for example, does chance play in your life? Is it chance if you arrive too late to board a plane, for example, to find later that the plane crashed? Perhaps your late arrival was caused by a chance meeting with a friend at the last moment, or by a misplaced ticket, or by a traffic jam that seemingly had nothing to do with you at all. You may have become a part of the drama of a natural disaster or avoided it as a result of other seemingly chance occurrences. What appears to you as chance or coincidence, however, is actually the result of the amazing organizations and communications active in the psychological reality of Framework 2. Again, you form your reality, but how? And how do private existences touch each other, resulting in world events? Before we go any further, then, we must look into the nature of Framework 2. This will not be a dry intellectual exploration because the intent itself will begin to trigger within your lives the emergence of hints and clues as to your own immersion in Framework 2's creativity. I want to interject something here. I told this before, but maybe you hadn't heard this one. This is something that happened to me that was a directive that I would be okay, that there were those who watched after me and my husband, Bob. We often would pick up pennies when he was out of work and we were in California and running out of money, and he was losing his memory and all kinds of bad things were happening. And I thought, oh, we're so alone and we're so desperate and our lives are just filled with anxiety. And we used to walk because he didn't have a job. We were living in a hotel room, and we'd see pennies on the ground, on the pavement, and we'd always pick the penny up, but we always cursed the little penny. I would always say, oh, it's just a penny. And Bob would say, nobody even bothers to pick up a penny anymore. So we'd pick it up, and then I thought one day, we always curse the pennies we find, and that's not good. I mean, a penny is a penny. It's worth a penny. I should bless the penny. And so I did. But I just thought this to myself. I didn't say anything to Bob. But when he found that penny, the last time that, that we said those two things about it, I said to myself, if Bob can find a penny, then he can find a dime or a quarter just as easy. And that's all I said to myself, and I let it go. And then we decided to go to the beach. And Bob goes running across the sand, and he stops real suddenly, and he calls to me, and I walk over to where he is, and he's holding in his hand a dime and a quarter that he found on top of the sand. And sand is the hardest place to see and your coins in because they get covered with sand. But they were laying right on the very top of the sand, and he picked them up and showed them to me, and I was like shocked. I thought, you don't know what I just thought less than 30 minutes ago when we were walking on the sidewalk. And I told him then, of course, that I had thought that he could find a dime or a quarter, and there he goes and finds a dime and a quarter and calls my attention to it. So now my attention was that, yes, we are being in the thoughts of someone who's watching over us or helping us in some invisible way. And this was probably their way of letting us know they're there and not to worry so much. And things did get better after that, but I lost my sense of fear. I mean, I was very fearful for our continuing to be people who didn't become someone who lived on the streets. I was really worried about that. But things all worked out. I won't go into that because that's too much to tell. But I thought that was just wonderful. And I made up a saying. And the saying is, bless a penny and you will have blessings a plenty. So things that happen to you like that, they stick with you and they stay in your mind and they help you know and have a belief that you're not alone. You never are. And if you think that you're living in a way where you're trying to help yourself and others, you're going to find creative ways to do things. because if you let go of the fear, you can get through some of the promptings that Spirit would have you begin to pursue. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because this sort of sounded like, that kind of a relationship with the second Framework 2 helping you in Framework 1. Chapter 4. The characteristics of Framework 2, a creative analysis of the medium in which physically oriented consciousness resides, and the source of events. Next chapter. Give us a moment. No chance encounter of physical elements alone, under any circumstances, could produce consciousness, or the conditions that would then make consciousness possible. If you think of your world with all of its great natural splendors as coming about initially through the auspices of chance, through an accident of cosmic proportions, then it certainly often seems that such a world can have no greater meaning. Its animation is seen as having no source outside itself. The myth of the great chance encounter, in caps, that is supposed to have brought forth life on your planet, then presupposes, of course, an individual consciousness that is, in certain terms, alive by chance alone. It is somewhat humorous that such a vital consciousness could ever suppose itself to be the end product of inert elements that were themselves lifeless, but somehow managed to combine in such a way that your species attain fantasy, logic, vast organizational power, technologies, and civilizations. Your myths tell you that nature itself has no intent except survival. It cares little for the individual, only insofar as the individual helps the species to endure. In its workings, nature then appears to be impersonal, even though it so consists of individuals that it cannot be regarded otherwise. Without the particular plants, animals, people, or even individual cells or viruses, nature has no meaning. Your physical universe then had a non-physical origin, in which it is still couched. In the same manner, your individual consciousness has an origin in which it is still couched. Give us a moment. Framework 2 represents the inner sphere of reality, the inner dimensions of existence that gives your world its own characteristics. The energy and power that keeps you alive, that fuels your thoughts, and also the energy that lights your cities, all have their origins in Framework 2. The same energy that leaps into practical use when you turn on your television sets also allows you to tune into the daily experienced events of your lives. End of session, end of dictation, unless you have questions. I pause, tired. I don't know what to say. To parallel these sessions, it would be nice if the two of you kept Framework 2 in mind and utilized it with a bit more confidence and became alert again to those coincidences that always appear in current experience. I bid you a fine good evening. Thank you very much, Seth. Good night. Unknown Reality contains a number of references to the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist who lived from 1875 to 1961. For those who are interested, as soon as Seth mentioned the psychological activity of atoms and molecules, I was intuitively and strongly aware of connections between his statement and at least two principles of modern physics. Yet I hesitated. I know my feelings are right, I told Jane, but how do I explain them in a few words and make any sense? I was also constrained by the limits of my own knowledge, especially though I sensed relationships between Seth's idea on the one hand and both the uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics and the principle of complementarity on the other. The uncertainty principle, or the principle of indeterminacy advanced by Heisenberg in 1927, and part of the theory of quantum mechanics sets definite limits to the accuracy possible in measuring both the motion and position of atoms and elementary particles simultaneously. More importantly, to my mind, for the purposes of this note, the uncertainty principle maintains that there is an interaction between the observer with his instruments and the object or quality being measured. The complementarity principle, stated by Bohr in 1928, resolves the seeming paradox posed by contradictory experiments that show how light, for example, can be regarded as consisting of either waves or particles. Both experiments and conclusions are right and mutually exclusive. Whichever result is obtained is due to the nature of the particular experiment. I doubt if physicists in the 1920s were concerned about the psychological activity of atoms, molecules, or particles, although it seems that Heisenberg came close to Seth's idea when he considered the free behavior of an electron emitted by a light ray. Albert Einstein, whose own work was rooted in strict causality, found a notion like the free will of an electron untenable, even though much earlier, in 1905, he had laid the foundation for quantum mechanics in his special theory of relativity. Jane is largely unfamiliar with the details of the uncertainty principle and the principle of complementarity. Although the general ideas fascinate her, her feelings for these works of science, then, are the same as those she has for the ether. And I want to mention this, because some people who will be hearing this might be interested in this that I'm doing. I'm taking pictures with my digital camera of photons of light, and I'm getting amazing results, and I'm discovering that light has certain ways it moves, and I'm captured it in lots of its movements, and it carries a lot of things in it. I don't know what the things are, but they look like living things, and I know the light is intelligent and that the light is capable of having its own directive power, because the way these photons move about, it's amazing. So do go to my channel site and look at some of the things I have posted that show all these pictures I've been taking of photons of light, because I kind of think I'm looking at the ether. I kind of think that. I've thought of it as being a lot of different things, but mostly I think of it as being the ether. And I wish I could communicate with it, but all I can do is see it. And I'm glad he said that we have a relationship with our instruments looking at light, because my camera seems to be an extension of my own self sometime when I'm looking at this. And not only that, I don't just see it with the camera, I see it with the naked eye, only a little differently. I see light with lots of little floating things in it that look kind of like little worms with little round pieces of light in them, and they are going in all different directions and tangled, and they don't look real organized. They're very unusual to see. And I see them very much when I look directly into light, but I also see them on any day that there's light in the room, and I scrunch my eyes a certain way, I can see them just floating all around. But I know they're an inner landscape. They're not actually there in the space. They're in an inner landscape within me. But I don't know what I'm looking at, and I make a lot of conjecturing in some of the videos I've posted of it. I even have a little creature like from the light that comes into with one certain camera, he shows up. I call him Harry. He always looks pretty much the same, and he comes into view when I'm looking at the orbs. And even lately, when I say, Harry, where are you? As I'm taking the pictures, it's not long after I make that call that he pops into an orb, and it's like, oh, you must be a light creature in some way. I think I'm in touch with you, because he comes after I call. Not always. Sometimes I call and he doesn't show up. But pretty much always he does. But there are occasions when he doesn't. But anyway, I just want to interject that because I am interested in this now. That I didn't know this, reading this, I would be coming across anything about the ether. And so this very much interests me, and it might you too. And if you look at those videos I've made showing the photons of light, you might find that you can do it too. You can take pictures like that because I explain how it's done. It's very, very easy. Doesn't take anything but a digital camera and something made of glass that you can get the shine of light off of. Everything that shines has photons of light concentrated in that shiny place, and that's where those photons are concentrated and it's shining forth. There's a lot of activity of the light. So I suggest you look at that. Let me hear from some of you if you do. If you have any idea what you think I'm seeing. Now, a lot of people say, oh, you're just looking at dust that's magnified. But there's so much color, beautiful color combinations in all these orbs that I'm seeing. Just for the artistic value of how beautiful it is, even if you just wanted to see beautiful portrayal of colors, then it's well worth looking at even for just that. But I'm sure there's more than just that. Anyway, I will get on with the next dictation. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. In connection with the creation of the universe and with the creation of public and private events alike, let us for a moment consider a different kind of myth. Tonight, during a pleasant supper time, our friends Rupert and Joseph watched a television production based on the Cinderella fairy tale. According to the definition I gave earlier, this fairy tale is a myth. Surely it may seem that such a children's tale has little to do with any serious adult discussion concerning anything so profound as the creation of the known world. And most certainly it may appear no scientifically pertinent data about the nature of events can possibly be uncovered from such a source. For one thing, the Cinderella tale has a happy ending, of course, and is therefore highly unrealistic, with irony, according to many educators, since it does not properly prepare children for life's necessary disappointments. Fairy godmothers are definitely a thing of the storyteller's imagination, and many serious, earnest adults will tell you that daydreaming or wishing will get you nowhere. In the Cinderella story, however, the heroine, though poor and of low estate, manages to attain a fulfilling and seemingly impossible goal. Her desire to attend a spectacular ball and to meet the prince initiates a series of magical events, none following the dictates of logic. The fairy godmother suddenly appearing uses the normal objects of everyday life so that they are suddenly transformed, and we have a chariot from a pumpkin and other transformations of a like nature. The tale has always appealed to children because they recognize the validity behind it. The fairy godmother is a creative personification of the personalized elements of Framework 2. A personification, therefore, of the inner ego that rises to the aid of the mortal self to grant its desires, even when the intents of the mortal self may not seem to fit into the practical framework of normal life. When the inner ego responds in such a fashion, even the commonplace, ordinary, seemingly innocuous circumstances suddenly become charged with a new vitality and appear to work for the individual involved. If you are reading this book, you are already too old to clearly remember the constant fantasies of your early childhood. Children, however, know quite well, automatically, that they have a strong hand in the creation of the events that seem to happen to them. They experiment very often and quite secretly, since their elders are at the same time trying to make the children conform to a given concrete reality. that is more or less already mass-produced for them. Children experiment with the creation of joyful and frightening events, trying to ascertain for themselves the nature of their control over their own experience. They imagine joyful and terrifying experiences. They are in fact fascinated by the effects that their thoughts, feelings, and purposes have upon daily events. This is a natural learning process. If they create boogeymen, then they can cause them to disappear also. If their thoughts can cause them to become ill, then there is no real reason for them to fear illness, for it is their own creation. This learning process is nipped in the bud, however. By the time you are adults, it certainly seems that you are a subjective being in an objective universe, at the mercy of others, and with only the most superficial control over the events of your lives. The tale of Cinderella becomes a fantasy, a delusion, or even a story about sexual awakening, in Freudian terms. The disappointments you have faced indeed make such a tale seem to be a direct contradiction to life's realities. To some extent or another, however, the child in you remembers a certain sense of mastery, only half realized, of power nearly grasped, then seemingly lost forever, and a dimension of existence in which dreams quite literally came true. The child in you sensed more, of course. It sensed its own greater reality in another framework entirely, from which it had only lately emerged, yet with which it was intimately connected. It felt itself surrounded, then, by the greater realities of framework 2. The child knew that it came from somewhere else, not by chance, but by design. The child knew that in one way or another its most intimate thoughts, dreams, and gestures were as connected with the natural world as blades of grass are to a field. The child knew it was a unique and utterly original event or being, that on the one hand was its own focus, and that on the other hand belonged to its own time and season. In fact, children let little escape them, so that, again, they experiment constantly in an effort to discover not only the effect of their thoughts and intents and wishes upon others, but the degree to which others influence their own behavior. To that extent, they deal rather directly with probabilities in a way quite foreign to adult behavior. In a fashion, they make quicker deductions than adults, and often truer ones, because they are not conditioned by a past of structured memory. Their subjective experience then brings them in rather direct contact with the methods by which events are formed. Will you open this beer for our friend? Do you want to rest your hand? Okay. Children understand the importance of symbols, and they use them constantly to protect themselves, not from their own reality, but from the adult world. They constantly pretend, and they quickly learn that persistence, pretending in any one area, will result in a physically experienced version of the imaged activity. They also realize that they do not possess full freedom, either for certain pretended situations will later happen in less faithful versions than the imagined ones. Others will seem almost entirely blocked and never materialize. Before children are acquainted with conventional ideals of guilt and punishment, they realize that it is easier to bring about good events through wishing than it is to bring about unhappy ones. The child carries with him or her the impetus and supporting energy provided him at birth from Framework 2, and he knows intuitively that desires conducive to his development happen